Hello students, I welcome you all to the E-class of Science at Kadariya. As I said in the previous video, we'll discuss today about the topic of pollination. So what is pollination and where does it occur? Okay, come, let's see what is pollination and all the aspects of it. So pollination is nothing but the process by which the pollen grains reach a stigma. See here in this picture, you can see a butterfly. It collects the pollen grains from one flower and it reaches it to the stigma of another flower. So this is the process of pollination. The flower that receives pollen grains is called as pollinated flower, and the flower which doesn't get the pollen grains is termed to be as unpollinated flower. In general, there are two types of pollination. First is artificial pollination and second one is natural pollination. The pollination that takes place by any such human actions is called to be as artificial pollination. So, artificial pollination is nothing but it takes place by any such human actions, whereas human hands transfer the pollen grains from one flower to another flower. So see here, these are the steps involved in artificial pollination. See, a man is removing a stamen from a flower, exposing a stigma of another flower and dusting the pollen from this stamen. And what he does is, he covers the flower with bag and labeling the stem. So these are the processes that takes place in the artificial pollination. Whereas in nature, there are many ways in which pollen grains reach the stigma of the flower and it is called as natural pollination. So in natural pollination occurs by nature, in which there are many ways where the pollen grains reach the stigma of the flower. So one such way is through wind. So pollination that occurs through wind. And then pollination that occurs by bees, insects, birds and butterflies. So what happens is, the pollen grains stick to the wings, legs or abdomen when they move from one flower to another. So this is how pollination occurs. The natural pollination is further divided into two kinds. One is self-pollination and another one is cross-pollination. What is self-pollination? Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. So, it occurs in one plant itself, whereas it either occurs a transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of the same flower, or transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of same flower to another flower. So you can see in this picture, the first picture, the anther transfers the pollen grains to the stigma of the same flower. Whereas in the second picture, the anther transfers the pollen grains to the stigma to the another flower of the same plant. The self-pollination occurs in the same plant, maybe either in the same flower or in the another flower. So examples of self-pollination, that is plants and trees which undergo self-pollination, are beans and then tomatoes. And most probably paddy is mostly self-pollinating using just gentle wind as a pollinating agent. So paddy mostly uses the wind as a pollinating agent. Next is cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same kind. Here, the same plant concept need not to be happened here. Here, cross-pollination is nothing but it can occur the transfer of pollen grains from a flower of one plant to the flower of another plant. So, it doesn't take place in one plant itself, it takes place in between the two plants but of same kind. For example, the cross pollination takes place between two hibiscus flowers. That is, two hibiscus plants. Plants are different, plants are separated, but the species is same from hibiscus to hibiscus. So cross pollination is nothing but it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same kind. See here. So this is how pollination takes place. So let us see the pollinating agents. Who are the pollinating agents? The agents that are helping in pollination are called as pollinators. For example, hummingbirds, butterflies, bees, wind, animals and so on. Even bats also undergo as the work of pollinators. So, there are some examples of plants that undergoes cross-pollination. Apple, strawberries, plums and pumpkin. These all plants undergo cross-pollination and use insects as their pollinating agents. See here. So, these undergo cross-pollination. So, in the next class, we'll discuss about fertilization in plants. Last but not least, here is a saying, be kind and pollinate positive growth in others. Thank you.